Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Well, we're on tour again today. Well, I say we, but actually it's only me, as James is on his own personal tour in the US without us. This time we're at the Wellcome Genome Campus Conference Centre in South Cambridge at the CW International Conference, affectionately known as QUIC. As some of you know, I've spent more than 25 years in the tech space, so this is really my natural home. It's where CW, otherwise known as Cambridge Wireless, convene their members of tech companies large and small, and they bring them all together at this event that's key for the tech calendar for Cambridge, for the UK and internationally. So I'm super excited to be here recording a Cambridge Tech podcast. I also think it is the most exciting agenda for the last few years. It's exploring how connectivity is now a ubiquitous part of our lives, how we're all connected, whether that's wearables, smart devices, connected cars, houses, cities, and on the list goes. So today there's been about 400 people attending in person, and there's also a virtual version, so goodness knows how many people have been joining online. There's been 39 speakers, 6 tracks, so we're going to find out some more about the topics from the people that have been presenting and supporting the conference today. First up, I've grabbed Julie Bradford, chair of today's conference and lead of the committee, to find out how the theme came about and all the different elements in the programme. So how did that happen?
It's a very good question, and I think the title of today's conference, it's intentionally ambiguous. A hyper-connected human. It's something that means different things to different people, but very much we were trying to understand user expectations of connectivity from lots of different perspectives, and I think that was very much on the back of what we did at QUIC last year, where we were talking about the sustainability of wireless networks, and part of that is around commercial sustainability, the business models for connectivity, and that's very much driven by the value that users actually get from that connectivity. So we very much wanted to put the user centre in front at the conference today, and the different sessions are trying to reflect the different environments and settings where we expect connectivity in our day-to-day life, and some of the big themes such as trust, security, and more immersive and collaborative content around the metaverse as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly grabbed my attention. I think it's a really strong topic to be covering, and it's great that CW is doing that. Dr. Shafi Ahmed this morning, he spoke about what an exciting time it was with a range of these exponential technologies coming through. So he listed like blockchain and quantum robotics, nanotech, wearables, and the list goes on. And I was actually talking about how everything's converging together. So it really seems to be the start of making some huge changes. And so I'm interested to know what your views are. Are there any key technologies coming out there? Are there any specific focus areas?
Yes, I mean, I think the vision that we saw in that keynote this morning very much picks up on the themes that we're trying to build into wireless networks with the transition to 5G technologies. So this idea of having low latency, high bandwidth, more immersive experiences. So for me, I think with where the technology is going, there's a lot of applications of, in particular, immersive content, more collaborative digital worlds, digital twins, and we're seeing that coming through not just in entertainment, but as we saw in the keynote, in healthcare, also in industrial applications, in training. It's the kind of technology that has got applications in so many different sectors beyond entertainment. So I think certainly immersive content. And for the UK, the creatives is an industry that we're particularly strong in. So I think that's a great area for the UK to champion as well. And I think the other technology area of interest is IoT, the Internet of Things. Lots of talk at the conference today about sensor technology, about trying to collect data from lots of different sources for different applications, and it's a huge challenge trying to manage that data, and making sure that the different applications don't get siloed in their approach, and that we actually have some compatibility across the networks and the sharing of data between platforms. So I think, for me, that Internet of Things and also the more immersive content is where the technology is going.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that there's so many options for technology, and I kind of wonder whether it's the infrastructure that's going to be the slowest. So we've got the ideas, we've got the technology, things are coming together. We've got to manage data better, but is the infrastructure actually there to be able to make these things a reality?
Yeah, well, it depends, I think, on the scenario that you're talking about for the infrastructure. So part of the challenge with networks is sometimes we think a bit ahead of ourselves, and we think about having connectivity absolutely everywhere, nationwide, in all the difficult rural spots. And whereas I think for some of these applications, we can start small and look at dedicated networks, in particular in building locations. And in my day job at Real Wireless, that's a theme that we're seeing increasingly, where users of wireless are actually starting to think, what network and what infrastructure do I actually need in my venue? The football stadiums that we work with are a really good example of that, where if you're building a new football stadium and you want your spectators and your retailers to have a fantastic connected experience, then you make sure you build connectivity in from day one. And as well, if you do that, you can ensure things like the visual impact of the equipment is built into your venue and your design plans as well. So it looks better, it feels better, and the whole thing gels together much better. And I think that's a key change that we're seeing. The user community is starting to realise you can't just take connectivity for granted, and you need to start thinking about, think small, build it into your venue initially, and then how do we start to join up these networks over wider areas.
Yeah, no, it's a really valid point, isn't it? I remember a few years ago having a conversation here in Cambridge with some of the powers that be about putting digital infrastructure in when you're developing new houses.
Yes,
you're putting water and electricity.
Exactly.
Digital is a utility, and I think that's changed. But you're right; it's kind of everywhere, isn't it? So the more we can think in a broader basis, the better.
Absolutely, and it's a message that Real Wireless as a company has had for the 12 years or so that I've been working for them. That the user community really need to think about connectivity and build it in from day one, and that's very much a theme that is getting traction with the market, and our whole client base is just diversifying now. So many more people, city councils, airports, new office blocks, and new developments. People are realising connectivity is a key component to the value of their venues and of their developments.
Yeah, you certainly need the roads in place to allow
Yes.
the good cars and etc. to ride on, don't you? So no, brilliant. Love the theme. Also love the fact that it's online as well. It's a proper hybrid event, and the content's still available. So good job, well done. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So the 6 tracks are security, identity and privacy, hyper-connected living, living in the metaverse, mobility and logistics, hyper-connected entertainment, and health and well-being. So hold on to your seats while we talk to someone from each of these tracks. Before we get into the art of the possible, the first track was on security, identity, and privacy. David Pollington, head of research at Block Ventures, talked about the difference of the you identity and the hyperconnected you. One has a passport and driving license, etc., that proves identity. The other has no validated identity. So my first question, welcome David, is what can or is being done to keep our virtual identities secure?
Hi there, Faye. It's a very good question. So when you look back at the history of the internet, it's great technological innovation, but one of the things it missed out was this identity layer. So there was nothing baked into the infrastructure of the internet for being able to support the identification, authentication of individuals transacting on the internet. So what we see is that, there are mechanisms that have been put in place, things like usernames, passwords, etc., that act as a proxy, if you like, for how a user can go online and actually claim an identity that they can then use for transacting. And what we're finding is that, a lot of those mechanisms, of course, are flawed. They're very easily circumvented. So now we have these additional kind of measures with sort of two-factor authentication. We've probably all experienced having using the mobile phone as a way of receiving a separate passcode. And essentially, these multiple mechanisms are a way to actually try to strengthen and create more robustness for the authentication mechanisms.
And you also talked about how when we're putting our virtual identities online, we might not always be very truthful.
Yeah.
What do you find about that, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, a lot of the service providers pre-GDPR were very keen to basically harness as much information as they could about their users. And, you can't really blame them. The more data they have, then perhaps the more they can mine that data and try and understand who their customers are, and then, provide them with better products, better marketing, etc. But of course, the issue is that, as individuals, we don't necessarily want to be having to give away all that information. If you go shopping down the high street, you don't have to tell them chapter and verse about who you are, where you were born, your age, and all these kind of things. So why should you have to do that online? So, increasingly what we're seeing is that people do want to be able to have different personas when they go into a virtual space. And really, it's not about them trying to hide anything or do anything nefarious. It's about them actually just trying to provide information about themselves which is proportionate to the context within which they're transacting. And really, that's the only thing that really matters to most people, is that they can have that confidence that the individual that they're transacting with is essentially trustworthy. And you don't necessarily need to know someone's date of birth or inside leg measurement in order to be able to buy something off them off eBay.
Yeah. Unless it's a pair of jeans.
Sorry,
I just couldn't help myself with that. So it's going to remain a big issue, the whole security, identity, privacy, and how it's handled. What do you think needs to happen to make it work? And is it to the extent that it needs government intervention?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned in the discussion earlier today, there are efforts ongoing by some of the standards bodies, so people like W3C and the Decentralized Identity Foundation, that are trying to now build this scaffolding for identity. So as I said before, we didn't have that in the initial iteration of the web or in Web 2.0. So now for Web 3, they're trying to build that capability. But ultimately, the problem is that it runs up against a conflict of business interests in terms of, a lot of the big players, they want to build up their own understanding and identity of their users, and they don't necessarily want to have to be relying on some third party, nationalized mechanism. So it is a bit of a land grab, as we said before. Companies still want to capture as much data as they can about their customers, but it's because a lot of the monetization models on the internet, as we're all familiar with, is that you then actually essentially monetize the individuals as the product, and therefore they need that data. But there are different activities in both standards, but also at a national level in countries like South Korea, Canada, etc., where they are actually trying to build something that can be used by all the digital citizens within that sovereign country.
On a personal note now, if I may, so you said at the start of your presentation, you've been at Block for 1 year.
Yeah.
But before that, it was 27 years in the telco space, and we're at CW. So I just want to get your potted version of what are the biggest things that you've seen over those 27 years.
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, it's been fantastic because when I started, a phone was a phone, and not many people had mobile phones. That's really showing my age. But I was really part of that whole process of how the phone evolved into being a multimedia device, and then an internet device, and then a personal navigation device. If everyone can remember back to the initial unveiling of the iPhone, and Steve Jobs was pulling everyone's leg, that actually he was launching 4 devices, and then he basically spun them all around and said, "Ta-da! There's the iPhone." So yeah, we've seen the smartphone basically come of age within that period. The way that people are now hyper-connected, which is the theme of the discussions today, it's just changed everybody's lives. And it's not just in the Western world, but in the developing countries as well. Everybody has really latched on to the value of being connected. And that's what the telco industry has really brought.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot going on, and it's not going to slow down, is it?
No, exactly. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
The last few years have seen an accelerated awareness and appetite for things like connected homes, hybrid working, telemedicine, smart energy, online retail. But the reality is that many of these are individually successful but not interconnected. So the track on hyperconnected living really tackled the case of how to bring the intelligence, size, power, and accuracy of everything we used to deliver a better individual and more integrated experience. So I've asked Paul Copping, CTO Fawley Waterside, to share with us his key takeaways from that session.
So we've been involved as members of Cambridge Wireless, who organised this conference for the last few years. And I'm always delighted to be up here. And my role today was chairing this session, which I've helped put together. We're trying to look at underneath the metaverse, which people tend to think of as being something visual, and say, how does that all connect at the layers down so that you've actually got some substance in the imagery that you produce? Because otherwise it's just sort of candy floss and pretty pictures. And we're at that stage now of trying to look at the best thinking in gluing stuff together. So we had some really interesting speakers that we managed to pull from not the most obvious companies, really. Dyson, who knew? Very, very clever people. And Bosch. And then our sponsor speaker was Edge Impulse, who are doing little sensors and the technology. And a mate of mine at Southampton University, who's a professor of artificial intelligence in citizen-centric AI. And he's got a team of very bright people who are looking at how to make all this work so that it benefits individual citizens.
So what did all these very bright people have to say?
Well, essentially, in different ways, they talked about the move towards things getting more connected and joined up at a micro level, and how that then all gets groomed into a big artificially intelligent understanding of what's going on, and then performs better so that people get a better experience, better use of the assets, and a better price.
And I think that's a key challenge, isn't it, with hyper-connected living? There's so many things, so many gadgets, devices, tracking systems. They can do so much, but they're all acting in isolation. And until we find a way of pulling them all together, it's just a bit of a headache.
Well, yeah. I mean, Bosch are very big in automotive electronics. And that's quite interesting, really, that you've got tens of thousands of sensors in a car, and it all interworks because it's got to. Because you're doing stuff in real time. You can't suddenly say, oh, I think I'll go and have a look at the sensors doing the brakes. So the automotive industry has cracked it and has got things working on a plug and play system where you can design and even upgrade and modify the artificial intelligence. And I'm not talking about, the super loony end of, well, not loony, but, the future not yet delivered end of autonomous driving. I'm just talking about your standard modern vehicles that have, and they may have sensors and rear view cameras and things that tell you if the tires are going flat and all of that, but it all works and it all interconnects, and it's not, you haven't suddenly got a switch platform. And that's, I think, a great objective. I'd love my house to be as interconnected as my car is.
Yeah, well, I think that's the way it's got to go, hasn't it? And it'll be interesting to see how it progresses over the coming months and years. Back in my IBM days, Second Life was just emerging. And I remember setting up my first avatar, Gritty Milena, for some bizarre reason. I think it was all anonymized. You know, they were random, weren't they, how they created the name? Obviously, Gritty got resigned to history. So my first question to Michelle Lim, who is Senior Behavioural Scientist at Cambridge Consultants, who has just spoken at the Living in the Metaverse plenary session, has to be, is the metaverse going to be any different? And do I need to brush the dust off Gritty?
I love that. Thank you for the question, Faye. And I really like that you've had a brush with, Second Life and what we would call maybe even a proto-metaverse or an early version of a metaverse before this hype even started. So that's really cool. I would say, and we had a question in the plenary session about, what's the difference between this new form of the metaverse and existing Second Life, all kinds of The Sims, even all kinds of games, which really enabled you to go in and pretend to live a life that you didn't live in the real world. And for me, Alex Rule mentioned something I thought was interesting, the idea that in the metaverse, it's interoperable. So you can bring assets from one world to another. So just because Second Life, is no longer quite so popular, it doesn't mean that you have lost all of the investment they've built inside. For me personally, what I think is really interesting is the idea that you can take something that you're doing in the virtual world and make it mean something in the real world. And I call that the concept of augmentation. So it could be physical augmentation, picking up new skills in the metaverse that, after the headsets shut down, you can still hold and with you and use. It might be, feeling closer to someone than you could than you could in current technologies, or it might be learning something new or experiencing something new. So for me, that's what distinguishes this new metaverse.
Yeah, that's great. And you also said you explained the metaverse as being this physical digital bridge. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. The reason why I see it as a bridge is because while it's easy to see the metaverse as a separate parallel digital dimension, I think it should encompass the bidirectional relationships between the physical and the virtual world. And that includes how you represent people as avatars, how you represent objects in the virtual world, the connections between human to object and avatar to model, that's a mouthful, connections, and even avatar to avatar interactions. So there are just so many multi-layered connections that define, I think, the new age of the metaverse. And if we're able to answer these questions and really nail these concepts, I think there's so much higher chance of your product and service or whatever you're building in the metaverse really taking flight, as opposed to people, looking at it saying, this is not something I want to do ever again and putting it down.
So what's your experience with the metaverse? Have you got anything that you currently do that you can share with us?
Yeah, so we do a little bit of stuff with digital twin simulations. We're looking at trialing consumer testing in the metaverse, actually, which is quite tricky because if you think about traditional consumer testing, it's trying to look at people in a constrained lab environment, asking if the things they do in that environment will apply to the real world when, say, they're grocery shopping. If you bring that to the metaverse, now you have like almost a three-way link between the real world. So you go from virtual to a constrained lab environment, the constrained lab environment to the world. So I think that's pretty tricky and that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly an awful lot going to happen in the coming years of people getting their heads around it, first of all, but then, adopting it. And I think Alex showed something that they were doing in PwC as well, which is quite similar to what you've been talking about. So I think a lot of the corporates are starting to dabble, if not quite successfully, in the metaverse.
Yeah, I think you're totally right.
Wouldn't it be great if everyone starts sharing all those experiences so everyone can get there a lot quicker than just trying to do it on their own? Yeah,
which is why I think platforms like CW and CWIC is so good, because it really gives us an opportunity to look at a whole range of what people are doing. And I've learned so much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for your time, Michelle.
Cool, thank you.
Let's talk about GrowthWorks. It's the fully funded program that's supporting the leaders of ambitious growth businesses to scale and double their profits and productivity. If you're looking to take your business to the next step, GrowthWorks will support you to plan bigger, scale faster, and stay ahead of the game so you can deliver on both your financial and market share targets. Exclusively for businesses across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, GrowthWorks is here to help you. Get started and arrange a call with them on www.growthworks.uk.
The next track was covering all things mobility and logistics. So whether that was increasing traffic congestion, the unviability of rural public transport, increasing demand for fast delivery of goods, rising fuel costs, climate change, all of those types of topics. So before the conference, Matt Napleton, Chief Commercial Officer at Zizo Software, released a paper challenging stakeholders to come together to realise the potential of hyperconnectivity for the automated and accelerated movement of people, items and goods. So Matt, hello. And is this the call because you think there's a change in attitude that's more important than the obvious changes in infrastructure?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question and one that I think we're not going to have the answer to right away, primarily because I think there are a lot of areas in play right now. For example, the data privacy issue is one that's been dogging this entire industry for many a year now. But also the aspects of how do I share that information without giving the game away? Logistics and in that kind of aspect is quite a unique industry in the fact that there are many players at work here. You're not just talking about the individual or delivery organization, you're talking about the entire supply chain. They all have to have that ability and that want to share that information across the entire level of data. But equally, the ability to share that data isn't quite there either. Right, we don't yet have the infrastructure available to say end to end. How do I visualize that data? How do I see that data? And how do I get that data to the people who need it in the right way in order to make decisions? So I think it's kind of a two-point approach in that when we know where we want to get to, and it's a great idea, but are we there yet? I think we have to challenge ourselves in quite a hefty way to do that.
So how? I mean, how does that progress? Because that relies on lots of people coming together and talking and sharing data and information.
It's a challenge we've had for a while. I think where we have to understand is an educational approach in hearts and minds that, you aren't going to break the bank if you share data. There are some things you should keep close to your chest. Absolutely. But actually, the main bulk of the information you have doesn't actually deliver any business value to you or any personal value to you unless you give that data context. One of the things we talk about at Zizo is the idea of a data lifecycle where we're collecting data, we're combining it, we're giving it context to drive change. And the fact that you're giving that data context by sharing it, by combining it with other data sets, allows that change in infrastructure. And we're starting to see that. People are starting to devolve a bit, but still they are very much putting their hands around it and preventing that from happening.
Can you just tell us a little bit about the content of the track? What was interesting? Any key highlights for you?
I think what was interesting for me was there was a definite theme around data and the sharing information being crucial to the impact on mobility and logistics. That actually the move away from traditional kind of logistical capabilities or networking capabilities from an infrastructure standpoint, i.e. hub and spoke, they aren't going to deliver the requirements that we need in this hyper-connected world. We're going to have to move to a much more localized set of infrastructure where decisions are driven much more at the edge, being supported by centralized infrastructure, but not driven by that centralized infrastructure. And that was, the key from Anna and Jan as well, about how we talk about EVs, EV charging points, as well as infrastructure and the mobility of people, as well as the mobility of goods. I think what was also very interesting was the notion that the sharing of information is going to improve over time, and that actually we're going to see that devolve into data-driven infrastructure requirements. For instance, highways agencies alongside different parcel organisations for delivery, that's going to improve and change as well by the devolving and understanding that actually this information does have inherent value, but only when connected with something else. So I think there was a really nice string and pull throughout that saying, actually, the data here is key. We have great ideas, but how we then create a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts is going to be key to driving this kind of systems forward.
And I think there's a couple of interesting points there, like one being the devolution of that data and involving other bodies, whether that be government or other. And then the other one was about at the edge. And I think one of the previous quick conferences was all about at the edge.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to see a lot more of that. The nano machine learning and those types of things are starting to come in now.
I totally agree with you. I think there's a big push in the States, especially with companies like Vapor.io, who are looking at true edge infrastructure, migrating away from the big the telcos to actually having managed infrastructure by cities themselves, or managed infrastructure or localized areas managing the infrastructure that relates to themselves, i.e. true edge, and then pushing that out into localized ecosystems where the flow of data for an individual actually responds to the area around them. So you've got really localized environments. That's starting to come, and that's starting something that's really going to be there. I think edge is going to be vital. Again, the technology isn't necessarily there. We've got guys who want a Raspberry Pi, for example. But going smaller than that, I think is going to be difficult. But again, there's an understanding. I know. Whereas when big data came around, it was a one size fits all approach. I think we've all understood that was never going to work. We've migrated to let's pick the right horses for courses. Let's say actually this technology is right for this technology is right for this, and then use different areas to then say we can do those different things. 5G isn't going to cover everything. We'd love it to, but 5G will quickly run out of bandwidth if we try and do that. It's then understanding how we can actually utilize the other technologies out there that still have a place in all this to drive those kind of requirements.
Yeah, and a couple of weeks ago, we had a company called InfoSense who were talking about this tiny ML technology, and there's a lot of similarity to what you've said there. Thank you very much, Matt, for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. And we'll put a link to the paper that's on CW's website. So if anyone has listened to you and wants to be part of that stakeholder engagement and, the management of data and all of those types of things, then they can reach out to you directly.
Absolutely. Yeah, please feel free. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you. The hyperconnected humans of today have a huge array of games and pastimes available for entertainment, relaxation, and education, where users can actually share in real time from anywhere across the world. Dr. Richard Bartle, Honorary Professor of Computer Game Design at the University of Essex, had some really interesting insights on hyperconnected entertainment. They basically suggested that the virtual world may be impressive en masse, but rather than bringing individual players together, it could actually isolate them. The final track was on health and well-being, where we heard that smart applications, wearable technology, AI, machine learning, virtual reality, they're all contributing to radically improving healthcare delivery and user experience. And that this was not just for the hyperactive and health conscious, but that it could enhance the quality of life for the infirm and support our ageing population. So to discuss this further, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Hannah Claridge, neurotechnology consultant at TTP, who believes that the future of connected medicine is here today and it's here to stay. So hi, Hannah. Let's start from the top if we can. Can you tell us about neurotechnology and how it is revolutionizing therapies in a connected digital world?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So I'll start with what is neurotechnology? It's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but to me, neurotechnology is any way in which we can interact with the nervous system. So that could be sensing what's going on in the nervous system, or it can be applying some form of stimulation. Now, the nervous system is part of the body that communicates through electricity. And what I find really fascinating is it's an alternative way of looking at the body compared to the biochemistry that's also going on. So if you think about pharmaceuticals as the traditional drugs that treat different conditions, that's one way of interacting with what's going on in the body. And neurotechnology, neuromodulation, is an alternative form of therapy, which is a different way of tapping into some of the things that are going on in the body. And that can be really valuable for things like chronic pain, where we know that some of the drugs like opioids have huge side effects. And being able to tap into the nervous system gives a completely different mechanism of action that offers patients more alternative options for treating the diseases that they're suffering from.
And can you tell us a little bit more about some of those innovations? Give us some other examples.
Sure. So there are lots of different parts of the nervous system that we can interact with. So one of probably the best known is pacemakers. So applying electricity to the heart in order to make sure that the heart, which is in many ways, it's an electrical part of the body. It's a combination of the tissue, but the tissue and the muscle, and that is being paced by electrical impulses. So if something has gone wrong in that, you're able to actually apply those electrical signals through a pacemaker in order to kickstart the heart and keep it going in something very close to its natural rhythm. So I think pacemakers are one of the earliest examples of neuromodulation devices. Other devices that you're probably aware of are cochlear implants for deafness. That again, that has an implant which interfaces directly with the brain, bypassing part of the ear, which is for one reason or another been damaged. But there are also other devices which people are perhaps less familiar with. There are deep brain stimulation devices where you actually put a really long, thin, tiny electrode into the brain. And by stimulating that, you can hugely alleviate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. You can almost remove some of the tremors that people suffer from. There are also vagus nerve stimulation devices. So the vagus nerve runs down the side of your neck. It connects the brain to a lot of the rest of the body. And if you apply regular stimulation in a certain pattern there, that's been shown to drastically reduce the incidence of epileptic seizures. It's also really related to multiple different functions of the body, such as the immune system. So it's also been applied for things like rheumatoid arthritis over a long number of weeks or months. It's been shown to really improve the symptoms there. So there are lots of different parts of the body where interacting with the nerves, interacting with the nervous system can have therapeutic effects if you understand enough about what's going on to know, what frequency you're stimulating out, what are the waveforms that you need, how do you do that, how do you interact with the body in that way.
What will stop it? What will stop this taking off in terms of being a hyperconnected human? Is it going to be the infrastructure isn't there? Is it going to be user adoption? Is it going to be something else?
I think it's about kind of how quickly can we get things through the regulated process that we need to get them through. So we're talking about the medical device industry. It's highly regulated for good reason. And there's a quite high burden of proof that you need to meet for both demonstrating the safety and the efficacy of the devices. You really need to be able to balance the risks that any device has, both in terms of the surgical procedure, but also longer term, the risks associated with having that implant and with the therapy that you're delivering. And that benefit the risk needs to be balanced with the benefit in a way that works. So I think I guess it is a barrier to adoption, but in many cases, it's just something that slows things down in the medical space is regulation. And I don't see that as a bad thing necessarily. It can be frustrating, but it's these regulations exist for really good reason. So I think ultimately the safety of these devices are critical, both for primarily for the individuals involved, but also for the industry. Maybe I can also comment on some of that connectivity space with the devices. So I think, lots of people have been talking about the connectivity of surgical robotics for training, for example. I think the space that I've really been excited about is connecting patients to their caregivers, to their clinicians. So the more that the device that's either implanted or that they're wearing as a wearable medical device, if data from those devices are able to be shared with their caregivers, with their clinicians, then the clinicians are able to make decisions quite remotely about their care. And increasingly, we're also starting to see medical devices that are kind of directly connected and can actually be updated remotely as well. So through technologies like Bluetooth, it's now possible for patients to meet with their clinician entirely remotely over video call. Not only that, but it's also possible for those clinicians to send them a digital prescription for a new set of parameters for their device, to optimize it, to maximize the efficacy of the treatment and to minimize the side effects for that individual. And I think being able to do that from the home, being able to do that automatically, and in time having that data analytics in place to do that completely automatically without the clinician having to make those decisions in between. I think that will really improve the care that patients get and will really enable that kind of next generation of devices and of care for patients.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
So it wouldn't be right to come to a CW event without speaking to someone from CW. So even though he's been super busy today, we've grabbed Obi Nahar, COO of CW. Obi, how's the event been today for you?
Hey, it's been really good. All right. It's really exciting, a lot of energy, seeing old faces, seeing new faces. Some of the talks have been really insightful around the hyper-connected human, some futuristic stuff, and some really cool startups, scale-ups in the exhibition zone too.
Yeah, the exhibition zone is really lively this year, which is great to see. And I think it's a good mix of the long-standing supporters of CW and also some of the new ones. And you've even got some of the Homerton changemakers
We have
right there as well.
Yeah, and they're brilliant. We've worked with them over the past, I think, about 6 or 9 months. And to have young people so inspired, so passionate, are focusing on social impact and, having tech for good is brilliant. Because, here in the conference, we're talking about, the hyper-connected human, and we're looking at commercial business models, but also societal impact is so important as a community in terms of what we're trying to do. So it's been a really interesting, good mix of people today.
Yeah, and the Twitter feed's been interesting as well, because there's been quite a few comments about tech for good.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely something on people's consciousness.
It is. And also, we're also aware as well is, look, we have to appeal to the young generation, put diversity into the core of what we're trying to do. And, talking about the metaverse, hyperconnections, it's relevant to the next generation as well. So not only are we talking about next generation of technologies, but it's also next generation of people and the future leaders as well. So if you look around, hopefully you'll see some young people walking around and engaging as well.
Yeah, I saw Pat trying to recruit someone for Texters earlier on as well.
Yeah, Texas is brilliant because that's an initiative also here in Cambridge, where also we're trying to get young people from the more challenging environments or challenging areas within Cambridge and provide them with digital skills. And not only provide them with digital skills where we've got industry leaders imparting a lot of knowledge and contacts, but it's also providing connections to help them to connect with industry and look at career progression as well. So I think as a community, it's great. There's investment in the regional community, but there are people out there who find it difficult to get in. So I think it's our role to actually help those people too.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
And I know we'll have to have you back on at some point talking about Cambridge Tech Week, because I know you're doing things with Cambridge Science Centre and Cambridge Launchpad for the future as well.
That's right.
So that ticks that box. Now, I have to bring something up because, as
Sure.
you know, sitting on the board for a few years, women in tech is obviously one of my things.
Mhm.
And actually, I'm really pleased to see you've got a good amount of women on the agenda this year. How was it? Was it still difficult to find those speakers?
It was difficult, actually, right? And, we're really committed to this. So Rachel and the team have gone out of their way, also with the committee members, to say when we have speakers and chairs, it has to be diverse and inclusive. So we've had to reach out to a lot of people to get through to those people and have women speaking. But actually, when you look at the women that we actually have, they're just brilliant, all right, in terms of representing what they're doing at the best. It just takes time and effort to go out and ask for it as well. But we're serious about it and we're committed in doing it because if we talk about diversity and inclusion, we have to practice it and preach it and do it.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great to hear. So thank you for your time. Can you just do a bit of a promo on CW? Why should people get involved? And anyone who wasn't here today, can they pick up the content from anywhere?
Yeah, so they can pick it up. I believe a lot of this information that was presented today will be available online. So go to our website. You should be able to access it. In terms of the membership, we've been going around for about 15, 16 years or so. So it's quite a rich environment of tech ecosystem people that we have. About 57% of our members are outside of the east of England in about 18 countries. So although it's Cambridge Wireless, it's actually quite far reaching in terms of what we do and the impact we make. And I think the benefit is if you're into tech, wireless, digital connectivity, you want to be part of a growing ecosystem, then reach out to us. If you're also young, diverse, inclusive, please reach out to us again. And we also have a program, initiatives where if you are under 21, you can attend our events for free as well. So, please do reach out to us.
That's great. And we'll
Yeah.
put the URL on the podcast as well
fantastic.
for you. Thanks, Obi.
All right, Faith, thank you.
The conference closed with a thought-provoking address by author, advisor, and commentator David Birch. David's talk was on growing the data economy and had some really specific calls to action in there. So we're thrilled to have David join us to give us a quick overview on that session.
Sure. Thanks very much for inviting me along. So the thing is, I don't want to sound like another famous person that you may remember, but we need growth. We have to have economic growth. But a bigger and bigger part of our economy is the data economy. Data is a bigger and bigger part of our economy. So growing the economy doesn't mean, I don't know, whatever it used to mean, digging more coal mines or making more bicycles or something. It means growing the data economy. And that's problematic because that means simultaneously moving data around the economy. I mean, data that sits in hoards, it doesn't benefit the society as a whole. It benefits the owners of the hoards, but we need it to work. And yet simultaneously, we want privacy. We don't want the data to be abused. And that sounds like a little bit of a paradox. But my point is we have technological and organizational breakthroughs which can make all the difference. And on the technological side, I was talking about what I've taken to calling counterintuitive cryptography. And what I mean by that is, from the world of Bitcoin and the blockchain, all this sort of thing, we have all this new cryptography now. We have zero-knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryption and so on. So we can move data around without sharing people's personal information, spraying it all over the web. Or to use the canonical example that everybody uses, there's a world of difference between proving to you that I'm over 18, like in a pub or something, and giving you my date of birth or my age or whatever. So we have these technological advancements which we didn't have a few years ago, which I'm quite optimistic about. But we also have, these organizational changes. I was discussing the idea of data trusts and, building on where we started with open banking regulation to move towards, more sort of open finance. People are talking about shifting away from financial services and towards financial health. And then ultimately onto more sort of open data in general, which deals with issues like big tech and so on and so forth. So there's this apparent paradox, but actually we have some technological changes which give us some opportunities there. And we also have these kind of new organizational structures emerging, which which allow us to use those technologies confidently. And of course, I finished up by basically saying, look, this means the government needs to push on with this open data agenda. And we've learned a lot of things from open banking. But we could learn from other countries now. Look at what Australia is doing with consumer data rights and things like that, and push it forward. And so, yes, we want growth, but we want to grow the new economy.
There are three things that kind of jumps out at me. It's the tech advances, and we've talked a lot about those throughout the day. Trust, I think, is really important, and David Pollington talked about that in his session as well. But actually, the thing that the whole thing on data economy and how data benefits society is super important, because there's just so much data out there, and a lot of it isn't actually being utilized. And it just got me thinking. We talked earlier about tech for good. What about data for good?
I mean, you're right. And, using data as a public resource for the public good is critical, because we need to build on that. So, and this is where these new institutions come in, because how can I persuade you to share look at health data. Health data is a very good example. How can I persuade you to share my health data, which will be for the good of society, confident in the knowledge that you're not going to abuse it and, spy on me and all this sort of thing. So the technology is one part of that, but I'm very curious about these new institutions. There's this idea of data trust, where the UK actually does have a little bit of thought leadership, especially combined with artificial intelligence. Because you need to feed these AIs with these massive quantities of data, and the potential for abuse is very great. So this idea that you have something like a trust, where you have trustees who ensure that the data is only used for the right purposes and ensure the right technology is used to keep personal information personal. Well, I think these are breakthroughs.
It's almost like we've gone full circle back to the first plenary session of the day on security, identity and privacy. You nail those, actually the rest of being a hyper-connected human kind of works.
I think we should set the bar very high on those, actually. I'm a little bit nervous when people talk about trading off security and privacy. I don't agree with that. I think we need we need security and privacy. We need to set the bar quite high on that. The point about identity, I think, is very central, not just to this, but to a lot of other issues. One sort of missing piece of the jigsaw is digital identity. I mean, if you look at the figures for fraud and we seem to have built this weird sort of identity thing where I've got to send a photocopy of, this is true, by the way, I have to do, I've got to send a photocopy of my driving license to my new accountant, who, by the way, is not an international expert in anti-terrorist counterfeit driving license detection. It's my accountant. She's going to put it in a drawer somewhere. You think that inconveniences like mafia super bosses from Ozark and things like, no, of course not. So we've ended up in this weird situation where we put all these speed bumps in for normal people, which do nothing but help criminals. And we need a real digital identity infrastructure, and we don't have anything like it at the moment. So actually, I think you're right to centre on that. I think that is a missing piece of the jigsaw.
I know it's the end of the conference and you're the last speaker, so everyone's going to want to be talking to you. So thank you very much for your time.
You're very kind. Thank you very much.
Well, that's it. What a day. The idea of Quick is to provoke ideas and discussion and really challenge technology's role and capability to deliver what is needed. And I think they certainly did that in the annual conference today. We hope you've enjoyed this quick insight into the hyper-connected human, and now I'm off to do something that CW is great at, a bit of networking. See you next week.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It will really help others discover the show.
If you are a startup looking to grow in Cambridge, the Bradfield Centre offers a range of flexible membership packages which put you in control of your office and home working mix. There's a vibrant, collaborative atmosphere, on-site cafe, plenty of green outside space, and regular member social events. For more information, visit bradfieldcentre.com or call 01223 919 600.